What do you do when your world crumbles silently? Not with explosions or fire, but with the softest, most invisible heartbreak. The kind of pain that doesn't leave bruises but settles in the chest like concrete. That's what happened to her. Her name is Clara. And up until that night, she believed that her story had already ended. It was raining. Not the cinematic kind of rain that feels romantic or dramatic. No, this rain was cold, tired, and indifferent. Just like Clara. She stood at the edge of her apartment window, hands wrapped around a mug of lukewarm tea she had reheated 3 times, but never actually drank. Everything around her was silent, except the soft ticking of the clock and the occasional sound of tires skimming across the wet street below. Inside, she felt nothing. That was the scariest part. This wasn't some theatrical breakdown. No screaming into pillows, no tearing up photos or writing angry letters. It was just emptiness. The kind that made her wonder if she had disappeared without anyone noticing. For months, Clara had watched her life quietly unravel. She lost her job when the company downsized. Then she lost the relationship she had poured years into, 5 years of compromises, birthdays, laughter, promises. Gone in a 5-minute conversation and a suitcase rolling across the hardwood floor. Friends she thought were forever slowly faded into acquaintances who responded with emojis instead of empathy. The loneliness crept in slowly, disguised as independence. She told herself she was strong, that she didn't need anyone, that she'd be fine. She lied. That night, something in her had shifted. It wasn't dramatic, but it was final. A whispered decision in the back of her mind. This is it. I'm done. I'm not trying anymore. She wasn't thinking about endings in a dangerous way.
She didn't want to die.
But she also didn't want to live not like this. Not with this weight in her chest and silence in her soul. She just wanted everything to stop. But just as she sank into that darkness, something shifted. It wasn't a miracle. Not at first. In fact, it came in the most annoying, inconvenient, and unwanted way possible.
Her doorbell rang.
At 11:13 p.m. Clara frowned. She wasn't expecting anyone. She wasn't ever expecting anyone anymore. She let it ring once.
Twice. Then a 3rd time.
Whoever it was, they weren't leaving. Wrapped in her oversized gray sweater, hair tied in a careless bun, she opened the door with the exhausted posture of someone who had given up on people. And there it was. The first thread that would pull everything back together. She didn't recognize the woman at her doorstep. She looked equally soaked and shaken, clutching a faded brown envelope with both hands. Her eyes were wide, filled with something Clara couldn't read. Not sadness. Not fear. Something else. "Are you Clara Hayes?" the woman asked, voice trembling. Clara's instinct was to lie. Say no. Close the door. Go back to the silence she had grown comfortable with. But something about the stranger's presence, how fragile she looked, how determined her hands clutched that envelope, made Clara pause. "Yes," she said slowly. The woman handed over the envelope and said, "I didn't know where else to go. I found this, and it has your name on it." Then, without another word, she turned and left. No explanation. No introduction. No chance for Clara to ask anything. Just her. Standing there in the doorway, with rain dripping from her hair and her past, somehow, clutched inside an old, damp envelope. She closed the door and stared at it. Her name was scribbled on the front in black ink, slightly smudged. Her heart began to beat faster, like it had been waiting for something, anything, to wake it up. This wasn't supposed to happen. She had decided to give up. She had wrapped herself in the finality of surrender. But now, she held something in her hand that didn't belong to today. It felt like it belonged to before. Or maybe after. She couldn't tell yet. Whatever it was, she didn't want it. She didn't ask for it. But it had arrived anyway. Sometimes, the things we never want are the things that hold the answers we've been too afraid to seek. Before the rain, before the silence, before the envelope, Clara Hayes was someone else entirely. She used to be the kind of woman who made vision boards in January and carried 3 different shades of lipstick in her purse, just in case. Her smile was wide, her laugh unfiltered. She loved Sunday mornings, vanilla coffee, indie music playing through the kitchen speakers, pancakes on the stove. Clara worked as a marketing strategist for a small but promising design agency. It wasn't a glamorous job, but it gave her just enough space to be creative and feel useful. She was good at what she did, really good. Her bosses knew it, her coworkers respected her, and her clients always requested her by name. And then there was Ryan. She met him at a bookshop of all places. She had knocked over a stack of poetry books, and he had bent down to help her pick them up. They laughed. He offered to buy her coffee. That coffee turned into dinners, road trips, lazy weekends spent building IKEA furniture and dreaming about the future. For 5 years, Clara built her world around him. He was charming, steady, and easy to love. She gave him all of her. And maybe that was the first place it all began to unravel, when she started giving and stopped noticing that he had slowly stopped giving back. It wasn't a sudden ending. That's what made it harder. Ryan became distant. First emotionally, then physically. The late nights, the missed calls, the vague answers. When Clara finally confronted him, he didn't deny it. "There's someone else," he said. "I didn't mean for it to happen." Clara didn't cry, not in front of him. She nodded, said okay, and let him leave. She cried later, of course. In the quietest ways. In the middle of the night, holding her pillow like it could remember his scent. In the elevator at work. In the grocery store when she passed the pasta aisle where they used to argue about red sauce or white. After Ryan, the world felt too sharp. The friends who once filled her weekends with laughter slowly faded. They didn't know what to say anymore. Clara had become a shadow of who she used to be, and shadows don't throw parties. She made excuses. Canceled plans. Said she was busy when she wasn't. She just didn't want anyone to see her unraveling. And then the job went. Budget cuts. A polite conversation. A cardboard box with her things. The worst part wasn't losing the paycheck. It was losing the one place where she still felt useful. For a while, she tried to hold herself together. She kept applying for jobs, forced herself to meet friends for coffee, even tried online dating once or twice. But it all felt hollow, like trying to paint over a cracked wall with water.
So she stopped trying.
Her days became a routine of nothing. Wake up, scroll her phone, make tea, don't drink it, sit by the window, maybe read a few pages of a book she wouldn't remember. And yet, for all her pain, Clara was never the kind of person to scream for help. She had learned early, too early, that emotions made people uncomfortable. Her mother used to say, "We don't fall apart in this family. We keep going." And so Clara always did, even when it cost her her own voice. That's why no one really knew how deep it went. No one saw the silent ache that wrapped around her like fog. No one saw how often she stood in front of her mirror, searching for the version of herself that used to shine. But beneath all of that silence, all of that numbness, something still flickered. It was faint, fragile, like a candle caught in the wind. But it was there. Clara still remembered who she used to be. And some part of her, buried under months of grief, still wanted to return.
She just didn't know how.
And then that envelope arrived. That strange woman on the doorstep. That moment that cracked open her numb routine. She hadn't opened it yet. It sat on her coffee table, untouched. Just her name written in faded ink. She kept walking past it, eyes flicking toward it like it was a ticking bomb. She told herself it was nothing. Maybe a mistake. Maybe someone else's memories accidentally sent to her. But a small voice in her chest whispered otherwise. Because Clara knew one thing. Things don't find you unless they're meant to. Even the unwanted ones. The envelope sat on Clara's coffee table like a storm cloud, silent, swollen with something inevitable. She avoided it for 2 days. Each time she passed the table, her eyes would fall on it. Her fingers would twitch. She'd think, just open it, and then she'd turn away.
Why?
Because she knew. Whatever lived inside that envelope, it wasn't a casual note or a wrong delivery. It was meant for her. It had found her doorstep at exactly the moment she decided life wasn't worth pushing through anymore. Clara wasn't ready for something that could change everything again. She had already lost her balance. Another push, and she wasn't sure what would remain standing. But on the third day, around 2 a.m., that witching hour when the world is hushed and honest, she finally reached for it. Her hands trembled as she peeled the flap open. Inside, there were three things: a photograph, a letter, and a folded map with one red mark. She stared at the photograph first. It was old, maybe 20 years or more. A man stood beside a young woman with auburn hair, their arms around each other, laughing. The woman looked familiar. Too familiar. Clara's heart skipped. She'd seen that face before, framed in faded family albums. It was her mother.
But the man?
She had no idea. Her parents divorced when she was just 5. Clara barely remembered the details. Her mother never spoke of the past, never mentioned another man. And yet, here he was, holding her as if they shared more than just a moment. Clara picked up the letter next. Clara, if this has reached you, it means I no longer have the chance to tell you face to face. You don't know me, but I've known about you your whole life. I've watched from afar, read every update, every photo your mother quietly sent me. She asked me to stay away, and I did, for her sake. But not a day passed where I didn't want to reach out. I'm your father, not the man you thought. The truth is he never knew. Your mother chose silence over chaos. Maybe she was right. But now that she's gone, I couldn't live with myself if I didn't try one last time. I'm dying, Clara. And I need to see you before I go. Please. I don't want forgiveness.
Just a chance to explain.
The red mark on the map. That's where you'll find me. Samuel. Clara stared at the letter, her entire body stiff. She read it 3 times, trying to process the words. Her father.
Alive. Dying.
Waiting for her. Her chest tightened with a swirl of disbelief, confusion, betrayal, and something else she couldn't name. Hunger. A hunger for answers. For truth. For pieces of herself she didn't even realize were missing. But she was also angry.
Why now?
Why not before? Why wait until her life was already falling apart to drop another secret into her lap? She didn't know whether to scream, cry, or throw the letter into the fireplace. Every cell in her body felt pulled in opposite directions. The next morning, she called the only person she still trusted, Elena, her childhood friend who had quietly stood by, even when Clara had begun pushing people away. Elena, she whispered into the phone. I just found out my father isn't who I thought he was. Silence. Then, a sharp intake of breath. Tell me everything. They met at a cafe, and Clara laid it all out, the photograph, the letter, the map. Elena listened, wide-eyed, holding her hand across the table. You have to go, she said gently. If only for closure. But what if it's a lie? What if this is just someone playing with me? Elena shook her head. Even if it is, you're not the same Clara who sat in the dark and gave up.
You're still hurting, yes.
But you're moving. This letter pulled something alive out of you.
Don't ignore that.
Clara nodded, her mind already drifting to the red mark on the map. It was a small coastal town she'd never been to, Westport. A quiet place by the sea, almost forgotten on the edges of the map. The next day, she packed a small bag and left. The bus ride took nearly 8 hours. Through forests, hills, and winding roads. She sat by the window, the letter in her coat pocket, replaying the words over and over. I've known about you your whole life. Westport was quieter than she expected. Seagulls hovered over docks, boats rocked in lazy rhythm, and salt hung in the air. The map led her to a weathered cottage near the cliffs. She hesitated at the gate. Her hands were sweating. Her heart thudded so loud, she thought it might burst. Then the door creaked open, and there he was. Samuel. Older now.
Frail.
Oxygen tank by his side. But his eyes, gray-blue and soft, widened the moment he saw her. You came, he said, voice raspy. Clara stood frozen. I don't know why, she whispered. Because you needed the truth, he replied. They sat on the porch for hours. He told her everything. How he and her mother fell in love at a university conference. How it was intense, complicated, but real. How her mother was already tangled in another relationship, one she didn't have the courage to walk away from. "She told me she was pregnant," Samuel said, staring at the ocean. "And then she disappeared. I begged her to let me be part of your life, but she said it would ruin everything. I believed her. I thought maybe loving you from a distance was enough." Clara listened.
She cried.
She didn't say much at first. Her head was full of ghosts. But with each word he spoke, something inside her cracked open, an ache she hadn't understood before now had a name. They spent 3 days together. Samuel showed her old letters he'd written, but never sent.
Gifts he had saved.
Drawings. Even birthday cards he kept every year, addressed but never mailed. The evidence of love lived in every drawer of that little cottage. On the final night, he looked at her and said, "You don't owe me anything, Clara. But I want you to know I never stopped being your father, even from far away." And then he gave her something that changed everything again. A small journal. Her mother's. Clara opened it with trembling fingers. The first page read, "To my daughter Clara, if you ever find this, know that everything I did to protect you. But not telling you may have been my biggest mistake." Clara sat in the corner of the dimly lit guest room in Samuel's cottage, the small leather-bound journal cradled in her lap like a fragile secret. It felt heavier than it should have, weighted not by its physical form but by the pieces of her mother that it held. She turned the pages with care, as if each one might shatter. Her mother's handwriting was delicate, looping, and familiar. The first few pages described the early days, university debates, moonlit walks, and the magnetic pull she felt toward Samuel. There were entries filled with laughter, with wonder, with that electric energy that only new love brings. But as she kept reading, Clara's breath caught in her throat. "I never meant to hurt anyone. I love them both. But with Samuel, I felt seen, truly seen. Not just admired or wanted, but understood. That terrified me more than anything." Page after page revealed what Clara had never been told, her mother's emotional war between loyalty and longing, obligation and freedom. "When I found out I was pregnant, I knew Samuel was the father. But by then, I was engaged to someone else. I didn't tell either of them the truth. I married Ryan's father. I raised Clara in a lie because I thought stability would be better than honesty." Clara felt like the floor had been pulled out from under her. Her entire identity, her idea of family, of truth, was cracked at the root. The man who raised her, the man she called Dad for 25 years, was never her father. And the man she'd only just met, who was now dying in the next room, had been silently watching over her for decades. Tears slipped down her cheeks. The silence in the room wrapped around her like a blanket of both comfort and sorrow. In the next entry, her mother's tone shifted. More regret. More tenderness. "I see Clara now, growing into her own light. And I wonder what kind of woman she'd become if she had known the truth. Maybe stronger. Maybe colder. Maybe braver. Maybe she wouldn't be so scared of her own feelings like I was. I only pray she forgives me when this all comes to light." Clara closed the journal and held it to her chest, breathing deeply, trying to absorb her mother's words, not just as truth, but as intention. She understood now her mother didn't choose silence because she didn't love her. She chose silence because she was scared, broken, and human. Later that night, she sat next to Samuel again. He looked weaker, his skin pale, his breath slower. The room smelled of salt and medication. Clara reached for his hand. It was warm but fragile, like glass warmed by sunlight. "She never stopped loving you," she said quietly. He turned his head toward her, tears slipping from his eyes.
She didn't have to say it.
"I always knew." They sat in silence, watching the moonlight drift over the waves beyond the cliff. The next morning, Samuel didn't wake up. Clara sat by his bed, the journal in her lap, the letter he had written resting on his chest. She cried, not in sorrow alone, but in recognition.
In peace.
In grief. In love. He had left her everything he could. His name. His story. His truth. And now, Clara had to decide what to do with it. 1 month later. Back in the city, Clara stood in front of her mirror. Something in her eyes had changed. The woman looking back at her no longer avoided her own reflection. Her shoulders weren't hunched. Her spirit no longer wilted. Clara had returned from Westport with more than just closure. She had returned with a clearer understanding of who she was and where she came from. She started writing again, something she hadn't done in years. At first, just for herself. Small entries, memories, dreams. But soon, words began to pour from her like they were always waiting for permission. One day, she emailed a piece to a local magazine. They published it. Then another. Her voice was no longer something she had to hide. Then something unexpected happened. She received a letter. Handwritten, no return address. I read your story in the journal. I don't know who you are, but I felt every word. You put into writing what so many of us can't say out loud. Thank you. Please keep going. Clara smiled. Unwanted. That's how she had felt for so long.
But now?
Now, she saw it differently. The unwanted moments, the unwanted truths, the disruptions, they weren't punishments. They were redirections. Each one had cracked her open so that light could get in. And now, that light was spilling out. One morning, Clara returned to the old bookshop where she had first met Ryan all those years ago. She didn't expect anything. She just wanted to remember that moment as her own. Not as a starting point for heartbreak, but as a place where a version of her once believed in love. She picked up a poetry book and flipped through the pages. A line caught her eye. You thought it was the end, but maybe it was the beginning disguised as loss. Clara smiled. Maybe this was her beginning. Maybe the end she had mourned wasn't the end at all. Maybe unwanted wasn't a curse, but a key. She stepped outside, the sky bright above her. For the first time in years, the weight on her chest was gone. She felt free. Not because everything made sense, but because she no longer needed it to. The unanswered questions would always exist. But now she knew, truth isn't always pretty, but it's powerful. And sometimes, the greatest gifts are wrapped in chaos. Clara took a deep breath and walked forward, into a life that was finally, fully hers. Life has a strange way of testing us, doesn't it? It pulls the ground from beneath our feet just when we think we've found solid footing. It brings us face to face with truths we never asked for, at the most inconvenient of times. And yet somehow, in that chaos, transformation happens. Clara's story reminds us that what we fear the most, pain, uncertainty, unwanted change, is often what we need the most.
She thought it was the end.
She thought there was nothing left worth holding on to. But when she stopped running from the shadows and faced them head-on, she discovered something remarkable. The parts of her life she once saw as broken were actually doorways. Doorways to healing.
To truth.
To herself. And maybe, to someone out there reading this right now, there's a similar truth whispering. Maybe you've been carrying the weight of someone else's decisions. Maybe you've questioned your worth, your identity, or whether you're even on the right path. Maybe, just like Clara, you've had moments where everything felt like it was unraveling. But what if this moment, this storm, this unexpected change isn't the end? What if it's the beginning of something new? What if the unwanted in your life is actually guiding you toward a deeper version of yourself? One that is wiser, braver, more open than you ever imagined.
You don't have to have all the answers right now.
And you don't have to fix everything overnight. But if Clara's story has shown us anything, it's this. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply keep going. Even if your steps are small. Even if your voice trembles. Even if your heart is still healing. Because with every page you turn, every truth you embrace, and every piece of yourself you reclaim, you move closer to a life that is honest and whole. So, I ask you this, from the quiet space between endings and beginnings. What part of your story are you ready to rewrite? Because it's never too late to start again. And just maybe the best chapter is the one you haven't lived yet.